two wrongs don't make a right. We've undoubtedly probably heard this phrase when growing up, and I want you to keep this idea in mind as you consider the aspects of this case. I'd like to introduce you to my client, Robert Ramirez. He grew up in the Rogers Park neighborhood, a rough neighborhood to be sure, but he made it out okay. He went to Sullivan High School, and there he met the love of his life, Mara. After his junior year of high school, he went on and became a carpenter, of which he's been employed in doing for the last 10 years. After a rough start in his childhood, Mr. Ramirez became what we consider a model citizen. He married his high school sweetheart, fathered a child, and has been employed as a carpenter for the last 10 years. Life was going well for him until an incident occurred on the night of December 7th, 1996. On that fateful night, Mr. Ramirez went over to some friend's house to watch an NBA game, the Bulls versus the Cavaliers. During that time, he partook of a couple of beers. After they finished watching the game, which lasted a little over 2 hours, they played some cards for an hour. Then he and his two friends, who had been he known since his childhood, went out and visited a couple of bars where my client, Mr. Ramirez, had some drinks of scotch and water. Afterwards, they wound up down at the local ball diamond where they had played sports together on the softball team for the last 3 years. They had a 50-yard sprint to see who could run the fastest. Afterward, they decided to call it a night. At about 3:30 in the morning, my client was driving down California Avenue when he first made contact with the defendants. They were driving slowly down the road, about 5 or 10 miles an hour. Now, who among us doesn't get irritated at bad drivers, even if we hadn't had a few drinks during the course of an evening? Who doesn't get annoyed at someone driving under the speed limit, let alone in the middle of the night when you expect traffic to be moving at a brisk pace? My client became upset and tried to pass them, and they blocked his attempts. They then went down Evergreen Avenue. My client became more frustrated as they continued to go along at a slow clip of 5 to 10 miles an hour. He began honking his horn, and finally the car pulled over. Now, at that point, my client had a choice. He could have simply just have driven off. Prudence would have dictated this. The defendants will undoubtedly try to hammer the fact that my client acted irrationally and did not behave in a civilized manner. However, regardless of my client's indiscretions that night, what he did not in any way, shape, or form justify the brutal force that was used against him, allegedly used against him by the police officer. After he pulled up alongside the car, he rolled down his window and began to yell out a few choice words about their driving. The other driver got out of the car, and so did my client, Mr. Ramirez. They then began to engage in a conversation between the two cars. The argument became heated, and in the heat of the moment, the other driver threw a punch at my client in the mouth. Reflexively, my client hit him back. The other man then grabbed my client and threw him up against the car, where they scuffled for a bit. Finally, the other driver, Mr. Levy, whacked my client in the stomach, and my client went down, and Mr. Ramirez went down, bracing his fall with his hands. It was only as they were scuffling, and when he was on the ground, that the driver first identified himself as a police hunter. He began to knee my client in the back. After he identified himself as a police officer, my client said, "Okay, show me some identification." The other officer got up, and as my client was getting up from the ground, he heard a crack and felt a sharp pain in his back like he'd been kicked again. Then he blanked out. Only later, when he woke up, did he find himself at Cook County Medical Center. and found out that he had been shot. As a result of the officer's actions, my client was hospitalized for over 2 weeks. He was then unable to perform his duties as a carpenter for over 6 months, of which he received no income. My client is here in court today not because of a personal vendetta or desire for vengeance, but simply to make up for lost income, for lost opportunities that he had. I want you to take a good look at this knife. This is a knife that the defendants will claim that my client had on that night, and that he in fact opened this knife and used it against Marvin Levy and stabbed him, thus giving the patrolman, the defendant, Walderman, the authority and right to shoot him in the back. However, we will use oral and demonstrative evidence to show that my client never owned such a knife, that he would never be carrying around a 6-inch pocket knife, and that it was not used. That it was found and recovered at the scene of the crime, closed, with no blood or fingerprints on it. I'm not going to lie to you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. We will be asking for money for you from this case. But as I've already said, this is not a matter of getting blood from a turnip. This is a matter of simply recovering the cost that my client incurred from the lack of being able to work as a direct result of the defendant's actions. I ask that you would do the right thing in this case, to find for my client and to give him the just settlement that he rightly deserves. Thank you.